Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. Welcome to episode 5, conversation Peter Vaill, David Fearon, thinking out loud about practice. Practice? Practice? What's that? Well, we return to our fundamental way of thinking about practice to kick off this phase of our conversation. We look at some more conjectures in light of what we've said and thought so far. So welcome to episode 5. I think before we get into this conversation, Peter, I'd like to remind folks of the point of departure for all of the thinking that we've been reporting so far.
Our way of thinking about practice.
Mm-hmm. We don't call it a definition or a theory. We just want people to know that if you have a little bit of something to stand on, things work better than if you're just free floating all the time. So I'm going to read it again, but I'll put it in terms of what I think about now when I think about practice. Practice is my conscious ability fairly consistently to produce intended results, and to do so across a wide range of circumstances, and to do so while growing and changing myself to meet the changing circumstances in which my practices exist. And I put that in plural because I'm doing several things to make myself grow and change through the circumstances as they arise.
Well, and as one of our conjectures is that practice is usually a collection of practices. So it's good to keep it plural, because the modifications you're talking about in that way of thinking are going to be in terms of a number of practices that all go together to make the focal practice that we're talking about.
So given how I stated it this time, I was looking from the inside out on that definition and on the wider question of what is practice. Is it your point of view, Peter, that practice is best known by the practitioner, known through the mind and eyes and brain of the person who is looking ahead and seeing what's going on and adapting?
Exactly. The point being that if we're trying to understand practice, I think, as we've said in an earlier podcast, practice is best understood from the point of view of a practitioner, not from the point of view of an external observer. That's your inside-out notion. And how often do we actually stop and observe a practice and a practitioner and criticize from the outside or make judgments from the outside? You love to play golf or on what I hope is a steep learning curve in your golf game. Just think about all the golfers. I love to watch PGA golf every Sunday afternoon. Think of all the golfers who come off the course moaning and groaning about their game when they've shot 65 or something. And what they're conscious of is all of the ways that they could have shot 62 or 61. And there was this guy, Justin Thomas, last week, who shot the 61 that won him the tournament. And he was on the green, he had a 25-foot putt or something. I mean, the probability of him making it was close to zero. It was a long, long putt. And the announcer comes on, and then a hushed voice says, he's putting for a 59. Well, that's the external point of view. From his point of view, he's just trying to make the darn putt. And he actually didn't make the 59 putt. He didn't make the 60 putt. He made the third putt for 61. So his consciousness was of the imperfection of his game. Everybody else was marveling at the perfection of his game.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm not saying that it's impermissible to look at things from the outside in an analytical way, or even just a way of simple enjoyment of the activity. But it is so much more fruitful to try to look at this from the point of view of the individual whose practice we're trying to understand. I might just say that one of our conjectures is, in fact, of the perceptual quality of practice. Practice is the way things look to the practitioner, the way the problem looks, the way the client looks to the practitioner, or the way the group looks if it's a practice in relation to a group. What the practitioner is thinking about, what the practitioner is emphasizing, what the practitioner is ignoring, what the practitioner is letting go. How many times have I walked into a doctor's office with some condition I wanted he or she to look at, only to find that from their point of view, it's not especially important. It's a pimple. It's not cancer. And we've all had that experience where a practitioner has a different point of view about the issue than the client or the customer. And so we use the word perceptual. In that famous book, In Search of Excellence, by Tom Peters and Bob Waterman, Peters says in so many words, thinking about excellent organizations, it's all perception. I think he says perception is all there is. And the point he's making is, if you don't look at it from the organization's point of view, you're never going to understand what is driving them and creating what we call as an external evaluation, what we call excellence. So an alternative word for perceptual is perspectival.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It turns the word perspective into an adjective.
Perspectival.
It is.
Perspectival.
My colleague, then doctoral student Eric Dent, used to walk in the office and use that term, and it always grated on my ear. Perspectival. It sounded so, I don't know, academic or something. Do we really need it? And all it does is emphasize the perspective, the glasses through which an individual is viewing the world. And if perceptual does it for a person, then by all means, let perspectival go. But there are times when it is useful to emphasize the actual perspective, where the person is standing, that leads them to think and feel the way they do. Okay, so that to me is a kind of a foundational idea that a number of the conjectures that I hope we're going to talk about this afternoon, a number of these conjectures rest on the actual difference between the way the world looks from the outside and the way the issue looks from the inside of the practitioner's point of view.
Just pops into my head that when we're teaching, when we're working at a golf course as a pro, and someone says, "Will you watch me putt? Will you watch my drive?" There are many occasions when we, the practitioner, will seek an external point of view. Show me something that you see that I'm not seeing. But if the dominance is always deferring to the external point of view, thinking of us in management classrooms over the years, a lot of power behind the teacher, maybe the power of the grade book or whatever the power is, it kind of mutes what we're talking about here today, to have that external person judging, doing their own perceiving, and then putting into your mind what's excellent and what's not. So could we play around with that just a little bit? Because it just strikes me that we've got to look at a balance of power here going forward on behalf of our listeners, or even a little bit more power than the external person.
It is certainly not either or. You don't have to make a choice, and it's not necessarily that one is better than the other. I think the point of view that I'm taking is simply to call attention to the so-called inner frame of reference, because it gets such short shrift in so many ways, and we make judgments from the outside so often. But certainly there are plenty of times when the external judgments, evaluations, measurements are essential, and you have to look at the issue or the problem from an outside point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess the argument would be that the really mature and powerful way to function here would be to be able to move smoothly back and forth between the different points of view. Because, in fact, there's not just one external view. There are multiple different points of view from the outside, and there are multiple different points of view from the inside, too. The practitioner is not a monolith in his or her thinking, that they shift around in their perspective. And we need to be sensitive to that, too. And in fact, as we have said emphatically in these podcasts, practice is a learning process. So the practitioner has to be allowed to change his or her mind and develop and change. And this little way of thinking that you read at the very beginning actually emphasizes that kind of flexibility and self-modification, in fact. Define learning as self-modification in a certain sense.
I like that. I like the sense of that.
Yeah. It's a complex thing that we're talking about. Philosophers have debated it over the centuries. A couple of broken down management professors are not going to solve the problem in one podcast. But
I resemble that remark.
but I think what we're doing is trying to put this ancient issue of the point of view from which the world is seen. We're trying to weave this ancient issue into the understanding of practice.
That's right.
And to show how an understanding of practice and of the practitioner is that it's essential that we take account of both the inside and the outside. What were some of these other conjectures that we were going to talk about? Do you have a list somewhere, or is your memory better than mine?
I have the list, and I want to jump to one, Peter, because it says what practice is not, and it says that practice is not often experimental.
Right.
What do we mean by that?
Well, I'll take responsibility for that one. If it doesn't make any sense to you, then...
well, it probably would if I really went back and read carefully what we'd written about it. But it on the one hand, we're saying make up your mind as a learner, literally learn to make up your mind. And on the other hand, we're talking about experimental and not experimental.
Yeah.
Let's play with that one.
The conjecture is that again, here we are with a perceptual issue. From the practitioner's point of view, I'm suggesting that the practitioner is not experimenting in kind of the classical meaning of that word, because the practitioner can't just unwind an intervention that he or she may have made with a client and say, oh, by the way, that experiment didn't work. Let's try another one. From the client's point of view, that's kind of nerve-wracking.
Yes.
from the client's point of view, he or she would like to feel that the practitioner knows what they're doing, and that the interventions, the suggestions the practitioner is making, the solutions, problem solutions that the practitioner is offering are carefully thought out, and they're not experiments. They're careful interventions. Whether it's a one-on-one relationship, like a doctor and a patient, or an attorney and a client, or a practice in relation to a group, say an internal auditor in relation to the finances of a whole department, that the statements that the practitioner makes are taken as more than just experiments. And so my suggestion is that the practitioner himself or herself isn't experimenting so much as they are conducting a conscious learning process themselves in relation to a client or a group of clients, and that they might feel that they need to change direction and maybe withdraw or modify a series of interventions that they've been making, but not because these are not because they're experiments in the classical sense, but because at the time they were the practitioner's best thinking about what needs to be done. And if it turns out that that idea about what needs to be done turns out not to be appropriate or not to be a useful approach, okay, learn from that and try to synthesize a new approach that takes account of what we have learned already about the client or the community's point of view. And I'm just saying that if you think in terms of the classical experiment, where the experimenter is free to then withdraw the treatments that have been made and try others without consequence. From the practitioner's point of view, there are consequences of the interventions. It's important that they not be regarded as simply as experiments, but rather as interventions that represent the best judgment at the time that the practitioner had. I hope that doesn't sound too garbled to you, but that's kind of the essence of the conjecture.
No, it's not, because what I'm hearing is that the best thought you can bring to the moment, because practice is action, and that's how we pick up whether in that moment our knowledge is working or not. But I can also see there's a role, definitely a role, for the classic experimenter who does the work in a more controlled way with a scientific method and all of that, and then reports out to the practice world. Here's something new to think about. Here's something you didn't know. Now we know it. So it is an either or there too, but I see that the practitioner is out there always on the edge of time, being tested in a way that the laboratory never does. And you're being tested with people in it's their lives that you're involved with at that moment.
Right.
It's a lot of responsibility to know what you're doing.
Well, but even in a slightly more, maybe let's say a slightly more lighthearted way, when you're standing there getting ready to hit a drive on a 450-yard dogleg to the left, your drive is not an experiment. Your drive is a commitment of your best judgment, the best application of your skill, such as it is. And so your ball lands where it lands, and you have to deal with where it landed in the next shot.
That's right.
And the game of golf has all kinds of arcane rules about what to do when the ball lands out of bounds,
yeah,
in a sprinkler head, or all kinds of things that can happen to the drive. that may or may not be the practitioner's responsibility.
One way or another, you got to get to the green and get the ball in the cup. So there's a lot there, and now I get a better idea what we meant by practice is not often experimental. There's another one here that's gets back to perception, I think. Practice often precedes theory. Since we're now talking about what experimental, what science produces in the way of theory, practice often precedes theory. What does that mean?
Well, I love this one. You could write this happens to be a conjecture that I feel pretty good about in terms of its validity. You could write a book. You could write several books around this conjecture. I think that, namely, if you take the substance of a given field and you ask where have the key concepts come from? How did they arise within the field? What was their source? The conjecture here is that it is frequently the practitioner in that field who comes up with the initial insight. I'm trying to remember, I think it was Galileo who was, or I may be wrong about this, it was one of those early experimenters or scientific inquirers, investigators, who was trying to get water out of a mine. That was the practical problem, and they figured out how to get the water out of the mine, and that led, at a theoretical level, then to the principle of the siphon, and the use of air pressure, differential air pressure, to move water seemingly uphill. But the practical problem was preceded all of the mathematical theory that ultimately became a foundational idea in physics. One of our most cherished theories in the management and leadership field is the notion of management by objectives.
Yeah.
Well, that arose from practitioners who informally began applying the notion of setting objectives and pursuing them, and using that as a way of evaluating the performance of an individual, as well as the process of solving the problem. And another one that I happen to be personally present for, the idea of matrix organizations. Matrix organizations are now found in a whole chapter in the textbook as as an alternative to bureaucratic hierarchies. But they were invented by the Rand Corporation, a combination of the Rand Corporation and the TRW Systems Group in Redondo Beach, California. And the practical problem they had was that they were hiring all of these high-powered scientists from the East. And the high-powered scientists did not want to function in cubbyholes. They wanted to talk to their colleagues. They wanted to work in a multidisciplinary way. They just did not want to be locked into a job definition in a hierarchy. And so the idea of the matrix, where you have rows composed of projects and columns composed of disciplines, that a given scientist might work across several disciplines on several different projects, and have a different supervisor for each one. These are all characteristics of matrix organizations. They would make Max Weber turn over in his grave. One
Father of bureaucracy.
Primary inventors of the pyramidal bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. Because from his point of view, the matrix structure fractures fractures authority and a chain of command beyond all recognition, and we just can't have that, as he would have felt. And you can kind of go down the list within your practice. This is something that we can test this conjecture against the reader's own or the listener's own experience. So the way I would put it is, within your field, think of some of the most important concepts and theories in your field. Where did they arise? Where did they first begin to be synthesized and practiced and evolve? I think you'll find that a very significant number of key concepts came out of practitioners and their efforts to deal with specific issues that they had with their clients and client organizations.
But something had to happen there. You happened to be there at the time in California, earlier in your career, when initially the complaints from the East Coast scientists started, people to have to scratch their heads. But my point is that in any of these times, when from a problem solving of a practice nature stems a theory, there has to be some people whose practice in a way is thinking theoretical, who have that other state of mind that says, let's see if we can generalize this condition and codify it and then tell people about it. You've been around doing some of that in your career, because I've seen some of your ideas in your books, and then they get repeated. And sometimes they don't even know that was your concept. Theory and practice, I think, is something you taught back when I was your student in the late 60s, looking at theory and practice. But perhaps that came from other people. But when you're looking for the theory, when you're observing practice or even having practice, and then you want to put that up into a shareable entity called theory, then you've got the best of both worlds, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, why not? Particularly if you can frame the theory in some kind of a way that retains its connection to the practical problem, so that you can carry it from one place to another, and you don't have to go back to a laboratory, or you don't have to have a supercomputer doing some kind of multiple regression analysis on the problem. I think my memory now as we talk is that a number of key concepts in statistics initially came out of back of the envelope doodling by some of the famous names in statistics, who came up with ways to analyze specific bodies of data, which subsequently were then generalized into models and more theoretical techniques that could generalize the approach, a correlation coefficient, for example, or something like that. So I would emphasize that this conjecture is a rich one, and I would urge listeners to try it out in your own area of expertise. Where does some of your favorite theories and concepts come from? And I'll bet you'll find that a lot of them came from the practitioners within this field, not handed down in the form of deductions.
I think we sometimes feel that those theories came down from the gods, or came out of the mind of one brilliant mind, and maybe many of them have over history of mankind. But I'm thinking now about people who are going to step ahead in the next few hours or days, and they're going to step right into a problem, just like we said in the fundamental definition that we read at the beginning of the podcast. Circumstances have changed. It's a problem. So I think probably initially they start thinking, is there anything I've learned in the past? Is there a theory that will help me figure this out? which would be lovely. In some cases, there isn't. And maybe when there isn't, because the circumstances are so different, and then they start talking to others about what they're struggling with, maybe that's the birth of still another concept, whether it's in a sport or in organizational action, wherever. In other words, could it be that practitioners like you and I or anyone else who's listening could be the source of a conversation that leads to a new theory or an improved theory?
Exactly. I think we also need to say that practitioners being human beings and being focused primarily on the problems that they encounter at the practical level often have ideas in their toolkit or methods in their toolkit which could very easily become new concepts in the field, but they just don't get around to writing the article or formalizing the data they have because that's not their focus. And I feel like I've met a number of practitioners within the fields of management and leadership and so forth who could, if they wanted to, write a new book about something in the field of practice that they have encountered, but they just don't get around to it. And I say, you ought to write that up. You ought to write that up.
Yeah.
I have a psychologist friend who I'm trying to remember now how at a time of attention deficit disorder, and there was a lot of attention being paid to attention deficit disorder, he casually said, offhandedly, in a kind of a cocktail party environment, he said, a lot of what we call attention deficit disorder is not that, it's intention deficit disorder, that the person has ideas that they would like to follow up on, but they just never get around to it. And
I like it.
I've always thought that was just a brilliant insight. And every time I see him, which is a couple times a year, I guess, at conventions and things, I say, Jim, what have you done about intention deficit disorder? And he smiles and says, nothing.
My intention to write it up, but I don't get around to it.
That's right. That's a good point. Because he's a practical psychologist, not a theoretician, not a professor, and so forth.
It seems though that going forward, one of our grand ideas for the world in regard to this conversation is that we need to see more partnering of very intensive and very smart practitioners with a person or persons who can observe, listen, be talked to about them, and then go back to the laptop, go back to the whiteboard and do some modeling or do some putting those words on paper and put it back to them and say, what do you think? I suspect that does go on, has always gone on, but practice is getting more, in my experience, anyone's practice is getting more complicated and difficult by the moment. And so if they did have these relationships with people who can do that, there would be some pretty fresh fodder for new or revised theory. What do you think?
Well, you're reminding me, or I have not thought about it this way before, but in a way, what you and I are doing is taking intuitions that I'm sure many people have had over the years, and we're trying to formalize them a little bit with this idea of practice with a capital P. Whereas you might talk to a given practitioner and his or her reaction might be, oh, sure. Well, I thought about that many times, how different the perspective of the practitioner is from the theoretician or the external observer. But it's kind of a given. I don't worry about it too much, they might say. So we're worrying about it. We're saying, look, it's everywhere. Yeah. The gap between the actual practice of practice and the way people talk about it and the levels of understanding they have is too great. And of course, you and I, as teachers, the people who are paying the price are the students. learners who walk out of the classroom or the learning experience with their heads full of theory, but without much of a sense of how it's actually going to get applied in the practical world.
That's right. And that has been a motivation for your work for years and for our collaboration,
Yes.
which began late last year. Yes. That gap is bothersome. So we are now one way that we're getting people out to listen in and give us their thoughts. And there is a feedback mechanism that we're building into these podcasts. I think the conversation is necessary, and as I've said several times, it's actually a lot of fun to do conjecturing. We're conjecturing, which I guess right. is sort of the early stages of something that eventually becomes looked at as solid theory. We may never see any of our conjectures get there, but so what? I mean, the point is we need to have access to theoretical thinkers. They need to have access to us as practitioners. And we've talked about co-inquiry and the teaching learning process in the classroom. This is another way it gets done. We're down to our last few minutes again. I've got to get off my soapbox in a few minutes. But this gets me going. I just get this feeling that there's a mission here. Let's see what we can do to close out this conversation and get ready for the next one.
I think we can both say that we've had a quite extraordinary learning experience in reflecting, meditating on the nature of practice. We're thinking about things that we've never thought about before, even though we have both of us have an exposure to practitioners, which is quite broad, and there's just a lot there that we've never done much with, and now we're trying to, our conjectures are attempts, I think, to make more sense out of all of this experience that we have.
That's right. I had a breakfast yesterday with a very senior level former executive from famous sports network. And he was telling me in words that flew so fast I could barely catch them, how he and several other smart folk are putting together a streaming series, in this case focused on the ages between 50 and 70. So my first point to him was, hey, you mean there's nothing after 70? But he said that is a pretty crucial period of time for bringing out essentially lots of different ideas for people to think about and use as they're practicing being alive between 50 and 70, which in itself is not an easy trip.
That's when the beer bellies accumulate, is between 50 and 70.
Yeah. But anyway, my point in this, and sort of capping this discussion off, is that as I was listening to him, I was listening as I would a business professor type, can they possibly make money? And he was flipping out all of these different equations that they've calculated and how much they'll have to make in the first year and all that. And it was quite interesting. But what I was really looking at was this person who was on fire. I mean, he was so excited. And because it had picked him back up out of a phase of his time after we left that organization where he wasn't doing this sort of high level stuff. And he's like, you're back in the game, aren't you? And he said, that's it. I have so much that I know, so much knowledge that I've taken nearly 40 years to acquire. I did not want to spend all my time on the golf course, at which point, of course, I said, oh, I see. I spend all my time on the golf course because I don't have any new ideas. And he laughed. But there's a lot we can learn, definitely learn from today's practitioners of every sort, and that will shape some of our conjectures going forward. So this has been fun, and we're out of time. So let's say goodbye to the folks, and we'll be looking forward to more of our conjectures in just a bit of time to get this next podcast together.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. It's been really a very interesting conversation.